The only reason Mary didn't freeze to death that first night was because she was too ashamed to tell the neighbor that her chimney didn't draw. The smoke backed up into her cabin like a curse, curling low and slow along the rafters, seeping into the clothes hung to dry, soaking her children's quilts, stinging the baby's eyes until the boy pressed his wet shirt to the infant's face and held it there like it could fix something. That boy, Sam, just turned 9, didn't say a word, didn't complain, didn't even cry when the soot got in his throat and made him gag. He just sat by the fireless stove, holding his sister, and watched his mother pace the floor like a woman losing her reason. Mary knew she'd built the stove wrong, or rather, she'd placed it wrong, too close to the inner wall, too low on the slope of the hill, too far from the draft. But there wasn't a soul around who'd help her shift it, not after all the talk. The men in town had already branded her a fool for trying to build the chimney herself, and worse when she said she'd do the masonry differently to keep the heat down near the floor. Woman logic, they called it. Backward as a mule in reverse. But none of them had been there when her husband coughed up blood last December and died choking on his own lungs. None of them had seen her youngest waste to bones, while Mary begged warmth out of the fire like it was a living thing that hated them. And none of them came when the wind ripped the roof off last month and scattered her firewood across the canyon like matchsticks. So when the first cold came this year, weeks too early, Mary lit the stove anyway, knowing full well the draw wasn't right, knowing the heat would barely lift, knowing she'd built something they all swore would fail. But it wasn't failure that scared her anymore. It was waiting for the cold to kill her last 2 children, the way it had already taken everything else. That night, after the smoke drove them out of the cabin twice, and the baby started crying in short, wheezing bursts, Mary did something no man in that valley would have done. She ripped the stovepipe clean out of the back wall, smashed the outer flue with a rock, and dragged the cast-iron stove, still burning, clear across the cabin floor. Sparks flew. The baby screamed. Sam shouted. Thought she'd gone mad. She didn't explain. She placed the stove on the opposite side of the cabin, right under the central beam, close to the floor, but right at the slope where the underground root cellar had caved last spring. She didn't even connect the chimney, just cracked the window, lit another fire, and told the boy to hold the baby and stay low. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow the heat stayed in. The smoke rose straight up, collected near the ridge beam, and rolled slowly out the cracked window. The cold didn't creep in the way it had. The floor didn't frost. The baby stopped crying. For the first time since the roof was patched, the cabin felt still. She fell asleep on the floor beside the stove, not knowing she'd just stumbled on the only stove placement in that entire valley that would have saved them. And word would get out soon, not because she bragged, because people would come looking for warmth and find it in a shack they once called a coffin. 2 days later, her neighbor's wife came knocking. Not the man, he hadn't spoken to Mary since her husband died, but the wife, Delia, with a basket of old linens and a look that said she'd seen the smoke curling from Mary's chimney the night before and couldn't believe it. "You got it working?" Mary nodded, cautious. "Draws good?" "Does now." Delia stepped inside, arms folded. Her eyes fell to the stove, still blackened from the move, still crooked on its bricks, and she frowned. "That ain't right. That placement." Mary just shrugged. "Ain't right, but it works." Delia didn't say much after that, just looked around at the children sleeping by the stove, the warm floor, the lack of ice on the window glass. She left without giving her opinion. But 2 days later, a second woman came, then another. And by the end of the week, Mary had a line of visitors she didn't ask for, all just checking on her, all pretending not to stare at the stove. Every one of them left quiet. None of them told their husbands what they'd seen. Not yet, but something had changed. The freeze deepened that week. Temperatures fell hard. A cow froze to death on its feet near Widow Cairn's place. Pipes burst in 3 cabins. The river iced thick enough to stop the ferry. And one by one, fires went out. Sam noticed it first. "Ma," he said, voice low as he watched the snow drift past the window. "They're watching us from the ridge." Mary didn't move. She'd noticed too. She saw the way the men started riding past her, land slow, not stopping but looking too long at the black smoke that rose from her chimney, while theirs choked and sputtered. One even dismounted, didn't knock, just circled the house once like a dog sniffing a place it didn't trust. That's when Mary locked the door, and that's when Sam started sleeping with the axe. Mary had no intention of sharing her trick, not out of malice, but because it wasn't a trick. She didn't understand why it worked. All she knew was the warmth stayed longer. The floor held heat. The air didn't burn their lungs or frost the windows. The baby slept. That was enough. Until the second chimney fire hit the valley, and someone died. A child this time, burned to death when the backdraft caught the tinder pile. And suddenly, every neighbor who had mocked her had reason to look closer. They came angry at first, not all of them, but enough. One man, Bledsoe, pounded on the door so hard it cracked the trim. "You think you're better than us?" he shouted. "You think you know how to Rig a stove better than a man? Mary didn't answer, but Sam did. Back off, mister. My ma don't owe you nothing. That was enough to buy silence. But not for long, because what Mary didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her odd placement had accidentally exploited something no one had studied before. A natural draw caused by the slope of the land, the lean of the house, and the placement of the subfloor pit from the collapsed root cellar below. It created a kind of pocketed convection, pulled heat low, sent smoke high, let the fire breathe in still air. In short, it worked better than anything those men had ever built, and they weren't going to let that stand, especially not coming from a woman they'd called foolish, not without taking it from her or burning it down. By the next morning, Mary found footprints. They circled the cabin twice, then vanished off toward the east ridge. Not just one pair either. 4, maybe 5 different boots, heavy in the snow, deep with the drag of men who didn't want to be heard, and light again at the edge of the slope where the drift covered their trail. Sam saw them too and said nothing. He just stepped out with the axe, stuck it harder into the chopping stump than usual, and walked back in like it hadn't shaken him. Mary didn't ask if he was scared. She already knew he was. But the kind of fear Sam carried wasn't the noisy kind. It was heavy and old and worn into his bones like the soot stains on his sleeves. It was the same fear Mary carried, the kind that doesn't scream, only tightens its grip. She spent the morning packing snow around the corners of the cabin, sealing every crack with mud and frost, running old wool shirts under water just to freeze them stiff and wedge them along the window panes for extra insulation. Every motion was slow, deliberate. The baby watched from her corner, bundled in Mary's old coat and too quiet for a girl her age. The stove gave off a soft hum, a sound like a heart beating low. The irons stayed warm all night, and when Mary opened the ash door that morning, she found coals still glowing. That had never happened before, not even in her husband's day. There was something strange about the way the heat clung to the walls now. It was different from last year, and not just warmer. It was directional. The warmth didn't rise as fast as it used to. Instead, it spread laterally along the baseboards, seeping into the floorboards like the fire was sinking into the wood and holding fast. The place smelled of pine and char, but the air wasn't choking anymore. It breathed. That night, they heard another sound, a knock, not like the pounding from Bledsoe 2 days ago. This one was slow, polite. 3 soft raps and a pause, then 3 again. Mary stood still. Sam held the axe without needing to be told. Then a voice, "Mom, it's Delia." Mary cracked the door just enough to see her face. Delia looked cold, worn out. Her scarf was frozen at the ends, and her lashes held tiny beads of ice. "I'm not here to stir anything," she whispered. The baby's got the fever. My girl won't stop shaking." Mary's eyes didn't blink. "I'm not asking to stay," Delia went on. "But please, if you know something, if you figured something with that stove." Silence. "I'll tell him it was mine. The idea. I won't mention you. Just help me." Mary stepped aside, only slightly. Delia didn't come in. She didn't expect to. She just leaned forward, shivering, eyes darting over the stove, over the way the pipe now angled slightly out the cracked window instead of through the back wall, over the bricks Mary had laid beneath it in a tight, slightly sunken pit just off the old root cellar's collapse. "That's it?" Delia asked, puzzled. Mary didn't speak, but Delia understood, or at least pretended she did. She left without another word. By dawn, smoke was rising from Delia's cabin again, but it was different, blacker, straighter, and the color was all wrong. A telltale sign the flue was misaligned. It meant smoke wasn't just escaping, it was flooding the walls first. Mary winced when she saw it. By mid-morning, the sheriff's boy rode out from town. Not the sheriff himself. He never came this far, but his boy had a mouth like a horn and rode too proud for his age. He stopped at the edge of Mary's fence, kicked snow off his stirrups, and called out, "Mrs. Thorne?" Mary didn't answer. "I got word from the town," he went on. "Some folks think you've been sharing dangerous ideas. Chimneys gone sideways, smoke backing up, fire almost took Delia's." He let that hang. Mary stepped out slow, her coat pulled tight, her face blank. "I didn't tell Delia to move a damn thing," she said. The boy scratched his neck. "They said she got the idea from here. She didn't get anything from me. She saw smoke. She guessed." He nodded, half listening. "Well, Pa says folks are talking. You might want to come in and explain it. Clear the air before someone thinks you're up to mischief." Mary looked at him long. "Your pa wants me to come into town and admit to moving a stove wrong?" The boy shrugged. "Not saying it that way. I bet not." He left with a twitch in his mouth that didn't become a smile. That night, Mary didn't sleep. She sat by the stove, turning coals with the poker, watching how the heat rose slow, then dipped along the floor. She poured a little water on the bricks, watched the steam twist down instead of up, like the air pulled it sidewise toward the collapsed cellar. It made no sense, but it worked. And now, It was getting dangerous. Sam came and sat beside her. "We can move it back," he said, voice low. "Put it where they expect." "No, they're mad. They'll be madder if they think we're hiding something." "Ain't we?" Mary didn't answer. The next morning, someone threw a rock. It hit the window and cracked it clean across. Not shattered, but hard enough to shake the wall. Sam was outside before Mary could stop him, yelling down the hill, but there was no one there, just a trail of boot prints already filling with snow. Mary patched the glass with old oilcloth, breathing slow to keep her voice from shaking when the baby woke and started to cry. They were being tested. The valley didn't like it when things changed. And it didn't matter if the change came from brilliance or accident. If a woman had done it, and worse, if it worked, it had to be either stolen or destroyed. 3 days later, everything changed again. A second death, not fire this time, cold. A man named Horner, found frozen in his chair beside a stove he couldn't get to draw. His wife found him blue, with a trail of half-burned tinder leading from the hearth to the door, like he'd tried to gather more wood, and sat down for just a second too long. The preacher gave a fast sermon. The town dug fast, ground too hard for a proper burial. They just piled stones, but nobody talked about Horner. They talked about Mary, because Horner had come by her place 3 days earlier, had seen the stove, had asked questions, had nodded and mumbled and looked long at the floor, and now he was dead. The next knock wasn't a neighbor, it was Bledsoe, and he didn't knock gently. He came with 2 others and they didn't ask. They just stood on her porch like they owned it. "You're gonna show us what you did," he said, "and you're gonna explain it, clear, so we can fix ours before someone else freezes." Mary stood silent in the doorway, baby on her hip, Sam behind her with the axe. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You moved the stove." "Accident." "Bull." He stepped forward. Sam did too. The tension pulled tight as a tripwire. "Look," said one of the other men, an older rancher named Till, "we're not here to start a war. But people are scared. Your place is warm. Ours ain't. You think we're just gonna watch you survive while our kids die?" Mary held his gaze. "I didn't ask you to watch. I didn't ask you here at all." Till looked tired. "Then give us the drawing, the plans, whatever you used." "I didn't use plans." They stared. "You're telling me," Bledsoe growled, "you moved a stove onto a hole in the floor and just happened to build the warmest cabin in the whole damn territory?" "Yes." "Liar." That word hung like smoke. Mary didn't blink. Bledsoe took 1 step forward. "If one more child dies," Sam raised the axe a fraction, and then Till stepped between them. "Enough," he said. "We'll come back." They left with cold eyes. Mary watched them go with a heart that didn't beat until the last boot step vanished. The day after the confrontation, the cold returned harder than before. It came not as wind, but stillness, and unmoving, bone-deep cold that made the snow crack underfoot and turned every breath into a warning, the kind of cold that killed not by storm but by silence. Mary wrapped her children in everything they had. She laid their bedrolls directly on the warmest spot of the floor, where the stove's heat pooled across the old cellar cavity. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was siege. The men hadn't returned, but they hadn't disappeared either. Sam saw one of them up on the hill at dawn, standing still by the tree line, watching. The figure didn't move, just watched until the stove's chimney gave its first morning puff of black smoke, then vanished back into the snow. Mary made no mention of it. Neither did Sam, but both knew what it meant. The valley had turned against them, and no one, not even the old women who once brought broth for the baby, would step through the door now. That night, someone tried to block the stove's air vent from outside. Mary found the rags stuffed up under the lean-to at dawn, ice-rigid and packed tight against the pipe that drew what little fresh air the fire needed to breathe. It didn't kill the flame, but it weakened it, enough that the inside had dropped several degrees during the night, and frost had started to creep back across the nails in the beams. Sam saw her pull the frozen cloth out with her bare hands. He didn't ask who had done it. He just waited by the door, axe ready. "They're testing how we hold," Mary said. "They want to see if we'll crack without a strike." She didn't say it to him, not really. She said it to herself. That afternoon, a storm rolled over the northern ridge, not a heavy one, just a thick veil of fast-moving wind that blew so cold it stole the sound out of the world. Snow beat sideways against the boards of the cabin, and the doorframe whistled like it had something to say, but couldn't get the words out. Mary worked fast. She moved bricks to form a barrier around the base of the stove. Nothing fancy, just a low wall that helped push the heat out horizontally across the floor. She carved shallow channels in the wood with a knife, not deep enough to weaken the planks, just enough to guide the flow of air toward the back of the room where the children lay. It was something she'd thought of the night before. The heat was already traveling along the subfloor cavity, but if she could shape that current, she might direct it better. She didn't know if it would work, but she did it anyway, because no one else would. That evening they got another visitor, not one of the angry men this time. It was the girl, Delia's girl. She showed up just after sundown, coat frozen, hair plastered to her face, hands bare and purple at the fingertips. Sam saw her first, opened the door before Mary could stop him. She collapsed into the cabin like a sack of flour, shaking, lips blue, eyes wild. "She said go," the girl whispered. "Said run to the warm place. Said don't stop." Mary didn't ask. She just pulled her in, laid her near the stove, wrapped her in the quilt with the baby, and fed her warm broth from the kettle. Delia hadn't come herself. That meant one thing. She was either too sick or dead. The girl didn't say which. Hours passed. The girl didn't wake. Mary sat beside the stove, poker in hand, gently shifting the coals, eyes locked on the pipe to ensure the smoke didn't backdraft. The air inside the cabin was perfect now. No haze, no frost, no crackling logs unless stirred. Just a deep, steady warmth that filled the space low and wide. The baby slept easy. Sam hadn't coughed in days. Even the woodpile lasted longer now. Mary only needed half the fuel she used last winter, but the door was not going to stay closed for long. At midnight, the snow stopped, and with it came the sound of horses. 3, maybe 4. No shouts, no voices. Just hooves crunching frost, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Mary didn't move. Sam held the axe in the shadows behind the door. The girl didn't stir. There was no knock, just silence. And then the crunch of boots. Mary heard them dismount, heard them stand close to the wall, heard someone lean close and breathe against the window pane. She saw the frost fog from outside. And then came the whisper. "She's got more inside now. She's harboring." A pause. "We go at dawn." They didn't wait for dawn. Mary moved. She woke Sam, slung the baby to her chest, bundled the girl as best she could, and unlatched the small crawl space behind the stove that led to the ruined cellar slope. It wasn't much, just a dented cavity in the earth, but it led out through a runoff channel under the brush, barely wide enough to crawl. She stuffed old quilts into the cabin to hold heat, closed the stove vent part way, and told Sam, "We're not running, we're watching." They crawled out just before the sky lightened. Mary led them up the bluff, where the pine trees grew tight and the wind couldn't see them. From there, they looked down at the cabin, breath held, limbs stiff with cold. The first rider came just after sun crested, then a second, then Bledsoe, and behind him 4 others. They came not with torches but with iron, tools, wrenches, hooks. They didn't want to burn it. They wanted to take it apart. Mary watched as Bledsoe dismounted and gave orders. They went to the stove first, through the door without knocking, bold as thieves. She saw them pause when they felt the warmth. One of the younger men knelt and ran a hand along the floor. Then they looked at each other, like men who had found something too good to understand. They tried to lift the stove, but it didn't move. It had settled into the floor now. The bricks were warm, sealed with frost-hardened mortar, sunk just enough that the weight of the heat itself pressed it down. They pried, grunted, swore. Then they started ripping at the boards around it. Mary stood. Sam grabbed her arm. "Don't. I ain't letting them ruin it," she said, and she walked down, straight down the bluff, right into the clearing. The men stopped when they saw her. She didn't shout, didn't run. She walked like someone who'd lived through worse. Bledsoe turned first. "You're trespassing on your own land now, widow." Mary didn't flinch. "You think we're just gonna watch you hoard the only warmth in the valley while the rest of us freeze?" "I didn't hoard anything," she said. "I survived. That stove wasn't a plan. It was desperation." Bledsoe sneered. "You expect us to believe that stove just happened to work better? On accident?" "Yes. You lied. You withheld. I didn't know it worked. Not at first. Not fully. And now you do. And you're letting children die?" Mary's voice rose. "I let my child die last winter, while your kind looked away. I buried a baby in frozen soil, while you drank warm in your homes. Don't talk to me about letting children die." The silence that followed cracked harder than any frost. Till stepped forward. "Then show us. Teach us. If it wasn't luck, then show us how to do it right." Mary stared. She looked past them, through the cabin door, at the stove she'd bled her hands on, the floor she'd dug with her bare nails, the coals she'd protected night after night. "You'll take it," she said. "No," Till said. "We'll build it ourselves, but you have to show us. We don't want your stove. We want to live." She taught them, not like a preacher, not like a man. She drew it with charcoal on old feed bags, showed how the slope under the floor made the air draw differently, showed how the heat stayed low because of the pressure of the sealed root cellar, showed how the vent placement mattered less than the floor cavity and the weight of the bricks. She told them it wasn't magic, it was mistakes stacked just right. They listened, they took notes, and when they left, they didn't take her stove, but they left her something else, respect, not spoken, not written, but when Delia's girl walked back into her mother's home, warmed by a stove now rebuilt in Mary's fashion, and when Bledsoe sent word 2 weeks later that his own home no longer needed 3 logs to do what one could do. And when the sheriff's boy stopped riding past and started tipping his hat instead, Mary knew something had changed. She wasn't foolish anymore. She was first, and no man could take that from her. The thaw came slow, not from the weather, that would still take months, but from the people. After the day Mary stood her ground before the men trying to gut her stove from the floor, something unspoken settled over the valley. No one said she was right, no one said they were wrong, but the visits stopped being hostile. The sideways glances from the ridgeline softened, the silence around her, name in town, loosened, if only slightly. What changed things wasn't just the heat, it was the fact that everyone who tried her method survived, and everyone who didn't. 3 cabins burned down in the weeks that followed, all with stoves placed too high, flues angled poorly, drafts caught by storms that reversed the smoke and choked families in their sleep. Another child was lost, an old man froze in his sleep, but those who'd rebuilt their hearths with the floor-sunk layout, whether they admitted it or not, kept warm. One man, Reuben Spence, who hadn't spoken to Mary since her husband's funeral, passed her outside the supply store and grunted, "Your way don't smoke." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't contempt, and that was enough. Mary didn't start talking to folks. She didn't start going to town socials or joining church suppers again. She didn't want anything from them, but she kept helping when they asked. Not the men, they were too proud still, but the women. They came with questions wrapped in recipes. They brought cloth scraps just in case. They asked to see the stove again, just to get a look. Mary never charged, but she watched, carefully, because it wasn't just a stove now. It was proof. Proof that she had outlived judgment. Proof that she knew how to keep her children warm in a valley that didn't want her to. It was Delia who brought the real test. She came walking back up the path one day with her daughter's hand in hers and bruises up one wrist she didn't try to hide. Her face was pale, thinner than Mary remembered. Her voice was quiet. "He blamed me," Delia said. "Said I'd shamed him by copying your stove. Said I made him look like a fool." Mary didn't reply. Delia nodded, accepting the silence. "I left, took the girl and went." "Where?" "No place. Just away. Been sleeping in the old feed barn behind the schoolhouse. Cold's worse there than I figured." Mary gestured to the stove. "You know how to build it now?" Delia shook her head. "Don't got the bricks, don't got the slope. Just a flat shed floor." Mary stood quiet a long moment, then said, "Come back tomorrow, bring a wagon." That night, Mary dismantled her own stove. Not all of it, just the floor work, the bricks, the pattern. She lifted the layers, wiped the soot clean, and chalked out the lines on burlap with her thumb. Sam helped her without asking why. He already knew. The girl had been cold, too cold. They couldn't let her freeze again, even if it meant starting over. When Delia came back the next day, Mary handed her the drawings. Not just a layout, but a method. Every mistake, every angle, every shift in weight and draft flow. "You follow this," she said, "and you'll burn half the wood, get twice the heat. As long as your vent's no higher than the belly, and your smoke goes up slow, not fast, you'll be fine." Delia looked down at the diagrams like they were scripture. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "They still call you names." Mary looked toward the woods, where Sam was teaching the girl how to split pine. "Because they stop calling you names when they're warm in winter, but they don't stop your children from freezing unless you teach them first." Word spread, again, not by gossip, but by results. Delia's new stove kept her shed warm enough to sleep in without shivering. Another widow, Mrs. Orlin, used the same design and saved her last 3 logs through the worst night of the season. A settler, 2 ridges over, who never met Mary in his life, copied the layout after hearing from his wife's cousin and wrote a letter back with just 3 words. "It works, thanks." The valley began to change, not overnight, not loudly, but where once there was mockery, there was now imitation. And then came the preacher. He showed up a month after the thaw began to crack the first ice on the river. He came with no Bible, no sermon, just an old stoveplate in his hands. "You made a name for yourself, Mary," he said, sitting on the edge of her porch. "They're talking about building with your layout in town, putting it in the new cabins come spring." Mary raised an eyebrow. "They'll call it theirs." He smiled faintly. "Some will, but others'll know, and more important than who gets credit is who don't get cold." He laid the plate at her feet. It was etched with names. 10 names. Women's names. Widows. Mothers. The ones who'd built the floor stoves. The ones who'd shared it forward. The ones who'd buried less this year. "We're gonna cast one for every home that uses the layout," he said, "to remind folks who taught them. To remind them it wasn't pride or blueprints or men's plans that kept this valley warm." Mary didn't answer. She didn't trust praise. But she let him leave the plate. She buried it under the hearthstone, just in case no one remembered later. That spring, a caravan came through, traders from the next valley, seeking pass-through routes and fresh goods. One of them, a woman named Rhea, asked to trade not for food or horses, but knowledge. "We heard there's a trick stove here," she said. "Some kind of underground fire system." Mary shook her head. "Not underground, just low. Just play smart," Rhea nodded. "Well, whatever it is, it saved 5 cabins north of here last freeze. I figured we ought to bring it home with us." Mary gave her the layout, gave her 2 copies, one for her, one to pass on. "Don't call it mine," she said. "Call it the foolish stove. They'll remember it better that way." Rhea smiled. "I'll call it the one that saved my brother's kids, because it did." And then she left, just like that, and the stove design traveled further. By late spring, Mary's own hearth was rebuilt, this time not from desperation. This time, with care. Sam did most of the lifting now. The baby, now toddling, played in the dirt with scraps of charcoal, smearing black across her cheeks and giggling like she knew she was home. The cabin still leaned, still creaked, still bore the scars of the winter siege. But it was solid and warm, and come fall, when the next freeze rolled over the valley like a silent wave, no one died, not one, and even the most prideful men built low and quiet, and they didn't ask why anymore, because they knew. The foolish widow's stove wasn't foolish. It was the smartest heating trick this frontier had ever seen. The following winter struck without warning. Snow arrived not in dustings but in waves, blanketing the valley in one long, breathless week. Ice clawed up from the rivers before November, crusting the edges of every roof, and the wind pressed hard from the north like a wall that never let up. Wagons froze where they sat, chimneys smoked all day. It was the kind of winter that would have once meant death for someone in every hollow. But this time it was different. This time the valley was ready. You could walk cabin to cabin and see it. Every hearth sunk just a little lower than the year before. Every stove set not against a wall, but central near the floor, vented smart. No more smoke-choked rafters, no more hoarding wood like gold, and no more burying children in frozen soil. Mary walked the ridge one morning and saw it for herself. Bledsoe's place had a new chimney, angled like hers. The schoolhouse had dug a pit hearth that heated both rooms now. Even the preacher's cabin had a plate sunk in the floor with 10 names cast in iron, warmed by a slow-burning fire that needed half the wood he once used. No one said her name. No one had to. The valley itself bore her signature in its warmth. One day, a letter came, folded neat, no stamp, carried by a boy she didn't know. He didn't say much, just handed her the envelope and walked off fast like he wasn't supposed to talk. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, stamped in clean black ink, Territorial Survey Commission, Frontier Housing Advisory Board. It read, "We have received word from several territories of a stove placement method in wide use across the high valleys, credited unofficially to a widow named Mary Thorne. If you are that individual, we respectfully request a written outline of the system you devised, with intent to incorporate it into regional building guides for winter cabins. Compensation available in goods or bond." Mary stared at it a long while, not because of the words, but because of what it meant. Not gossip, not theft, not scorn. Recognition, the kind no woman like her ever expected. She didn't write them back, not at first. Instead, she walked outside, stood over the ridge, and looked out across the spread of land that once wanted her gone. The wind blew sharp, but her coat held. The stove inside burned low, but steady. She heard the baby laugh. No longer a baby now, but a girl with fire in her eyes and frost-proof skin. Sam was chopping wood down below, his rhythm strong, clean, not frantic like the boy who used to swing the axe in fear. This wasn't a season of survival anymore. It was a season of proof. Proof that her foolish placement wasn't foolish at all. It was wisdom born in desperation, hardened by grief, and tested under fire. She wrote back eventually, didn't ask for bond or goods, didn't sign her name, just mailed the outline. With a note, "Don't call it mine. Call it the floor stove or the low-set method. Call it whatever you want, so long as you teach it right. The rest will take care of itself." By the following spring, rumors spread again, this time not in scorn, but in story. They said there was a woman in the valley who could build a hearth that kept warm with a single log. They said she figured it out alone, with no plans, no husband, no help, just a broken chimney and a desperation not to lose her last 2 children. They said her cabin had become a place of pilgrimage for widows, for settlers, for anyone tired of freezing to death while men bickered about draft flow and pride. They said it started as a mistake, a foolish mistake, but it ended in the warmest winter the valley ever survived. The last time Bledsoe came by, it was to drop a bundle of hickory at her door. He didn't knock, didn't linger, just left it stacked and gone before Mary could come out. But there was a note tucked into the top log, scrawled in rough pencil. It read, "Turns out the dumbest stove placement I ever saw was the only one that saved my kid's life." He hadn't signed it, didn't need to. Mary burned the note that night, not out of anger, but but because the truth didn't need keeping anymore. By then, Sam had grown tall. He rebuilt the back lean-to, fortified the roof, and even started sketching improvements to the stove based on airflow and material use. Not to make it better, just to understand it. Mary watched him one evening as he sat on the floor with his chalk, tracing the path of smoke through the air like it was a river he could navigate. He didn't know it, but every line he drew was another page in a new kind of wisdom, one not born in books, but in frost, in grief, and in a mother who refused to freeze quietly. The girl, now nearly 6, used to press her hands against the hearthstones in the morning and whisper, "Mama made this warm," and Mary would nod, never correcting her. Because it was true, she had made it warm, not just the stove, the world around it. By the end of that decade, the floor stove method had made its way into the catalogs. Mail-order kits from back east listed it as efficient hearth layout for extreme winter use. One company added the footnote, originally developed by settlers in the Northern Territories, but everyone in the valley still called it the widow's stove. And if you were lucky enough to hear the full story at a winter gathering, usually told by someone who hadn't lived it but wished they had, it always ended the same way. They laughed at her stove until it was the only fire still burning. Mary lived long enough to see the first schoolhouse built with her method from the start. Long enough to see Sam take over the repairs on cabins around the valley. Long enough to be asked, not ordered, to show up at the winter meetings and explain the best place to set your pipe if your home sloped just a little too east. She never raised her voice, never claimed to be right, but they listened because she was warm and they weren't. That's all it had ever been about. Not pride, not invention, just warmth. And now the whole valley had it, because one widow put her stove in the wrong place and refused to move it.